Thanks very much, Adam. So indeed, I have a background in philosophy, but this isn't an area that I have studied in any formal way, but it's an area of interest, and I wanted to talk about it today because I think it's there as an implicit background to a lot of the kinds of discussions that go on at events like this one and events in the past. And it may well be that people tend to have an implicit position on this issue, which could be quite reasonable in many cases, but I do think it's worth considering explicitly. So I want to look at, and I'll define techno-determinism in just a moment, but I want to look at why this is significant in terms of the notion that we are interested in optimising human well-being. And I'm going to consider the specific issue of determinism, techno-determinism, inevitabilism, and optimism/pessimism. And I'm going to look at how different positions on these issues can affect the way that we might want to frame our policies, our actions, our sense of leverage over the future. So let's look at some definitions. It's pretty hard to see that this was a fairly key work on techno-determinism, being a series of essays from a number of academics published in 1994. Does technology drive history? And from that title, hopefully you get an impression of what we're actually talking about here. There's no one strict definition of what techno-determinism is, as you might imagine, but a number of people have attempted to give definitions. And here's a small sampling. And I'm just going to press a magic button on this projector to see if we can, there we go, we don't have the edges cut off. So, Merritt Roy Smith, an American historian who's currently active, has phrased it as the belief in technology as a key governing force in society. Bruce Bimber, the idea that technological development determines social change. Rosalind Williams, an historian, simply that technology determines history. And Michael L. Smith, another American historian, the belief that social progress is driven by technological innovation, which in turn follows an inevitable course. So I'm going to focus on that largest definition, certainly not because it's the most compact, but because it captures both aspects that I want to talk about. Just briefly, I want to step back and create a broader framework. I do want to talk about social progress, but I want to contrast that with human progress, just in case we don't think that social progress is the full story about human progress. So let's look at the human environment as being the totality of conditions that directly impact human welfare. Human welfare and the way we cash it out is a whole different conversation. And I invite you to take whichever approach you prefer. I would tend towards a utilitarian position, and that's certainly something we could use as a starting point here. So when I talk about human progress, I'm looking at changes in the human environment which are going to produce alterations, positive alterations in human welfare. So let's consider two key aspects which may contribute to the notion of human progress. Changes in social conditions and changes in technological conditions. And in terms of defining these, common sense definitions are going to do just fine. The technological conditions are certainly broad enough to encompass things like the broader factors of our physical environment and the way we shape them. The way we access food, safety, shelter, communication, transport. And the social conditions, of course, will be impacted on by our personal social conditions, but also by the broader society in which we live. So our relative levels of freedom, perceived fairness, justice, liberty, security, inclusiveness. Those sorts of things, which I think fairly uncontroversially do impact on our quality of life. And certainly some of the things that in turn are responsible for social conditions are the institutions that we're surrounded by, the laws, the social norms that we inhabit, the philosophical ideas that are around, and of course the cultural values that impact on how we live. And it goes without saying that technological conditions are impacted by science and technology. And in the modern context, these are some of the key areas there. But what is technology? Well, historically, we could be very broad-based. We could be talking about everything from writing and fire and wheels onward, rocks of a certain shape. But because this is Future Day, and because I think it is the most significant issue, I really want to look at technology as we stand now and as it may progress in the future. So I want to look at advanced technology that doesn't necessarily impact on us yet. And I'm going to keep using this word determinism, and I just want to make the point that we don't need any strict definition here, but certainly nothing rides on the issue of determinism in any philosophical sense. If I'm talking about strong determinism, I just mean something like say, trajectory of a billiard ball on a table. A moderate determinism might be the weather impacting on how many people buy ice creams. But philosophical issues, as in, is the universe deterministic, do we have free will, really aren't relevant to this conversation. Strong techno-determinism, then, is going to be the view that technological progress determines human progress. And strong social determinism is going to be the view that social progress determines human progress. So when we looked at that equation, in each case, one is really saying that it's the social changes, the social narratives, the institutions that drive society forward, and in the other case, it's the research, it's the technical development that drives society forward. Let's just step back there and see whether that actually matters for a moment to the rest of what we're going to say. We could look at three different welfare models here. A hybrid welfare model would be to say that both social conditions and technological conditions are broadly equal in their contribution to human welfare. But if we combine that with certain forms of determinism, we can look at what set of conditions are still going to be most impactful. So a hybrid model techno-determinism is going to say that technological conditions are broadly going to determine social conditions. So even though both will equally contribute to human welfare, it will ultimately be the technological conditions that are the drivers. Conversely, if we're social determinists, we're going to say that, well, our technology is important and it has a big impact on our welfare, but really technology only changes as we create social progress. And so therefore, it's the social conditions that matter. We'll notice that even if we just say that all that matters is our social conditions, so that technology really made no one ever happier than our laws and institutions did, we can still be a techno-determinist, and we can still say that our technological conditions nonetheless produce our social conditions. So in that case, it's still going to be our technological conditions that ultimately matter, and vice versa. Or we could go for the other arm and say that really institutions, democracy, all that kind of stuff is nice, but it's really our material circumstances that determine how we feel, that determine the kinds of lives we lead. But if we do assume a technological welfare model, we could still be a social determinist within that framework. So we could still say that it's our institutions, it's our culture, it's our social norms which determine how our technology develops and therefore impacts on our well-being. So this is all fairly formal, but the point of it is just to say that if we're a techno-determinist, technology is what makes the difference regardless of how we think welfare is created. And likewise, if we're a social determinist. So, from the rest of what I want to say, I want to abstract from this notion of the welfare model and talk purely about what we think impacts upon what. And of course, strong techno-determinism and strong social determinism are going to be mutually exclusive here. Okay, the other thing I said I wanted to talk about, the other two things, were inevitabilism and optimism. Techno-inevitabilism. It's certainly a mouthful, it's not as bad as the next one. Techno-contingentism, which I have to confess, making up for the purposes of this talk. Someone can suggest a better word, please let me know. Strong techno-inevitabilism is the view that technological development is entirely inevitable. It's independent of political, social, cultural, economic, or historical factors. This could even be phrased as a kind of cultural technological Darwinism, which is to say that the cultures that survive are actually those that provide the most fertile ground for the kinds of technologies that want to develop them. So the culture is really just a basis for technological means. The strong techno-contingentism is the view that technological development is entirely dependent upon political, social, cultural, economic and historical factors. And really it can go any way depending on the context in which it arises, and it could progress forward or backwards depending on those factors. Now we could also posit similar categories for social conditions. And it's important to note that where, in the case of techno-determinism, social determinism and techno-determinism are mutually exclusive, techno-inevitabilism and social inevitabilism could be simultaneously true. Okay, so my plan is not to do any heavy lifting here in terms of convincing you of a particular position or even getting deep into the arguments for one position or another. Well, what I do want to do firstly is just take a look at some things that other people have said around this issue. Neil Postman, who's an American media theorist, sorry, I should note that I'll start with pro-techno-deterministic positions, has noted that the uses made of technology are largely determined by the structure of the technology itself, that is, its functions follow from its form, and I shouldn't say noted, has claimed. I was hesitant to include Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, but certainly his lifelong crusade was all about techno-determinism. And he was a very strong techno-determinist, but certainly no techno-optimist. Aldous Huxley, the British author, fairly techno-deterministic, somewhat pessimistic. Democracy can hardly be expected to flourish in societies where political and economic power is being progressively concentrated and centralised. But the progress of technology has led and is still leading to just such concentration and centralisation of power. So clearly Aldous thought that his Brave New World vision of the future was one quite likely to come true given the trajectory that technology seems to be on. Karl Marx is sometimes framed as a techno-determinist, claiming here that the hand mill gives you a feudal society and the steam mill a society with the industrial capitalist. A couple more for techno-determinism. American author Thomas L. Friedman has made the claim that Silicon Valley's technologies only flourish with the defence capability of the United States. And Marshall McLuhan, who is central to the techno-determinist discussion, which emerged at least as much out of media theory as out of philosophy of technology, has claimed that the most human thing about us is our technology. So if you, assuming you include our social conditions as part of our humanity, then he places technology as being very central. So let's look at some big positions contra techno-determinism. Layla Green is a currently active Australian media theorist in Western Australia. Her book Techno Culture from Alphabet to Cybersex was an important piece of work in this field, came out in 2002. Technology is always developed with a particular purpose or objective in mind, she claims, to benefit those who are capable of funding its development. Langdon Winner. What matters is not the technology itself, but the social or economic system in which it is embedded. Eli Parisa, some of you may have, in fact I'm sure many of you will have come across his work, an internet activist, recently wrote the work The Filter Bubble, What the Internet is Hiding from You. Now, here he's trying to pick apart something about the psychology of techno-determinism, which he thinks is suspect. So he makes the point, or he claims that coders sometimes harbour God impulses, they sometimes even have aspirations to revolutionise society, but they almost never aspire to be politicians. But for programs to shun politics completely is a problem, because increasingly, given the disputes that inevitably arise when people come together, the most powerful ones will be required to adjudicate and to govern. And certainly, this reminded me when I read it of some of you are involved with Less Wrong within that movement that's been mentioned earlier today. There's a phrase that politics is the mind killer. To which I kind of have this implicit response of, well, so what? It's also the thing doer. And sometimes doing things is very important. And of course the NRA can be seen as techno-deterministic. When they say that guns don't kill people. Oh, sorry, anti-deterministic. When guns don't kill people, people kill people. Now, I won't dwell on this because the screen's a little small. This cartoon is really emphasising the notion that another convenient reason sometimes to believe in techno-determinism for engineers, in this case game designers, is that, well, if I don't do it, someone else is going to, and technology happens, so I'll be a part of it regardless. Again, a little small XKCD comic. This is kind of anti-techno-deterministic, I think you could say. Will technology acts make us all geniuses? No. Will it make us all morons? No. Will it destroy whole industries? Yes. Will it make us less empathetic? No. Less caring? No. A teen's going to use it for sex? Yes. Were they going to have sex anyway? Yes. And so on and so forth. So, from his point of view, things change, but many of the social aspects of life go on. Let's look at techno-inevitablism then, the notion again that technology follows an inevitable trajectory in its development. David Chandler, the British semiotician, claims once technology is introduced into a culture, what follows is the inevitable development of that technology. John von Neumann, the famous 20th century Hungarian-American mathematician and polymath, nuclear weapons developer. Technological possibilities are as irresistible to man. Something I understand he said with a certain amount of trepidation and pessimism, as himself one of the developers, as I said, of the nuclear bomb. Kevin Kelly is characterised by Eli Parisa as a hardcore techno-determinist. He's the editor of Wired magazine and also the Whole Earth catalogue. Going some way back, so a core figure in the Silicon Valley scene. And in his book, What Technology Wants, he claims that, and of course, I said determinism, we're talking about inevitabilism here. Extrapolated technology wants what life wants: increasing efficiency, increasing opportunity, increasing emergence, increasing complexity, increasing diversity, increasing specialisation, ubiquity, freedom, mutualism, beauty, sentience, structure, and vulnerability. So this would seem to be a fairly strong claim that technology is really following its own course. Ray Kurzweil is an obvious person to include here. No doubt many of you will have seen this chart from Singularity is Near, where he claims that we have a countdown to singularity going on, following a number of milestones, and that there's a clear speeding up, accelerating pathway of progression through technological development. So who's got an opinion against techno-inevitabilism then? Well, Michael and Joyce Huysman in their book Techno, Why Technology Won't Save Us and the Environment. Anyone who allows the technological imperative to guide his actions has in fact given up any consideration of ethics in his decision making. So they're very concerned that the techno inevitabilist position kind of absolves us of responsibility and maybe buys us into a kind of fatalism. Steven Pinker, again a very well-known name, chimed in with the singularity debate to say there is not the slightest reason to believe in a coming singularity. The fact that you can visualise a future in your imagination is not evidence that it is likely or even possible. Look at domed cities, jetpack commuting, underwater cities, mile-high buildings and nuclear-powered automobiles, all staples of futuristic fantasies when I was a child that have never arrived. Sheer processing power is not a pixie dust that magically solves all your problems. It's interesting to note that the second sentence and the first, or the final sentence and the preceding ones don't really appear to be connected to me. I have huge respect for Steven Pinker. However, there is kind of, I'm not clear that he is clear exactly on what he's claiming here. But certainly, maybe part of what he's buying into is the notion that that welfare is impacted by multiple factors, and we'll look at that in just one moment. So let's just balance the considerations in that way. And here is just a grab bag of possible argument points. And of course, for and against, pro and con lists are kind of like the cheapest way of framing an argument, but I'm going to do it anyway for the sake of being quick. So, for the notion of determinism, we have the phenomenon of social lag, where we clearly see many circumstances that our social and institutional capacities, our legal frameworks, take a while to catch up with technological developments. We can see the political impacts of the printing press throughout Europe and how that really changed the course of history in many ways. Reduced infant mortality, we know, actually is a great way of reducing population proliferation because it leads to small families. And we see that throughout history there are multiple forms of matches between technological development and education, social enlightenment, communications. But on the other hand, we do have a lot of fabulous technology. We don't have equal access to that. The world arguably produces enough food, but certainly not everyone has enough to eat. We can see systems where we have advanced technology in the presence of repressive regimes and laws. It's not clear that technology and happiness are necessarily the same thing, at least not in any direct kind of correlation. And here's where I pick up Steven Pinker again. When he talked in his book, Shadows, sorry, the name will come to me, in his recent book about the peacefulness of the world and the increasing levels of peace, he mentions the long peace, the peace that we've had at least since World War II, and the multiple kinds of factors that can strongly be argued to have contributed to this. What he calls Kantian factors, nuclear factors, democratic peace, a liberal peace, a trade-based peace. All of these things are much more than just technology. And yet, arguably, a long peace is one of the most important contemporary manifestations of our well-being. And of course, there's this phenomenon of progress traps. These are controversial, but the notion of a progress trap is something that we can't necessarily get out of with our technology, but we can get ourselves into, and in fact, maybe a corner down which technology can direct itself to its ultimate detriment. So, for example, environmental collapse caused by modern capitalism could be a potential progress trap. And to fill in the rest of that argument, if you get that situation, you're not going to get technology determining necessarily a positive outcome at the very least. In terms of inevitabilism, We can see that there certainly seems to be a smooth development of information technologies over time. Moore's law is very inevitabilistic in a sense. We can see that in multiple areas we seem to get scientific breakthroughs at simultaneous points in time almost across the globe. Without communication, particularly, it doesn't happen so much now, but it certainly happened in the past. And if we have any evidence for technological cultural Darwinism, for the notion that cultures are somehow selected by their ability to support technology, then that would seem to be very inevitabilistic. But at the same time, technological regression does happen from time to time. I don't have the exact example to give you, but it's been shown that cultures which have been estranged from trade and from communication have historically gone backwards and regressed, given up multiple technologies when their level of trade can't support that development anymore. We get people selectively choosing to give up technologies. The Amish may be one example of that, but there are also perhaps lower levels examples of that in the contemporary era. And we certainly have many narratives, you know, right here in Australia, we have people who are very suspicious of technology and try to do without a lot of it. So there are Luddite type movements. We know that there are resource constraints which pose challenges for technology, and maybe, just maybe, there are restraints on human ingenuity as well. It's been pointed out, for example, that medicine had a golden age, arguably up to the mid-70s, and things have gotten a lot more difficult now. As we've seen earlier today, we're still doing very interesting work, but it could be that we'll reach a point where the complexity of further progress bars that from happening. Now, there's work to be done with all of these in terms of sifting through the various arguments and coming to a conclusion about the position where we want to sit. But it certainly seems clear that there are a wide variety of views on what may at first seem like a fairly cut and dried issue. But what I'm going to look at in the remainder of what I'm going to do is a kind of moderate determinism and an inevitabilism. And I think this is a particularly interesting position because it offers us the capacity to leverage, or talk about how we can leverage the future. For example, if we're completely deterministic and completely inevitabilistic, then largely all we can do is let technology run its course. But we can map out a position where we need to assess all factors, which is kind of interesting. This has also been called techno-moderate by Mackenzie, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that other name, but if anyone knows how that's pronounced, you can let me know. I also want to just pay lip service to the notion that maybe there's a bit of a false dichotomy going on here between social and technological factors, between us and technology. And maybe to some extent our social frameworks, our laws, our technologies of the kind themselves. And perhaps we shouldn't actually be putting a clear dividing line between these two things. So let's look at how levers for human progress actually cash out, depending on these areas of possibility. If we're strongly socially deterministic, and we're also contingentist about how technology emerges, we're going to be principally concerned with social levers. We're going to be principally interested in culture and politics in the way we think about the future. If we're a techno-inevitabilist, but we're still a strong social determinist, we still don't care too much about technology, really. Primarily, technology is going to do its thing, and sometimes it's going to be good for us, and sometimes it's going to be bad for us, but the way we make the world a better place is, again, through institutions, through the work of the humanities broadly, maybe a bit of economics. On the other hand, if we're strong techno-determinists, but we're contingentists, then we've got a lot of work to do, because technology is going to determine whether things work out well, but it's not going to happen on its own. So we've really got to choose and try and direct the pathways down which it heads. If, on the other hand, as I mentioned, we're inevitabilists, Well, there's not a lot we can do. Technology is just going to happen, and it's either going to make things better or worse for us, and that's just the way it is. Perhaps we can break and slow the process a little. Maybe there are things we can do to accelerate the process. But largely, we're going to be spectators to that process. Now, I've mentioned optimism and pessimism, but I want to bring that in as a third factor at this point. So, we could be techno-optimists and believe that ultimately technology does help optimise human flourishing, sometimes also called techno-progressive, largely synonymous. Techno-pessimists hold the opposing view, and bioconservatives are one good example of a group who are broadly techno-pessimistic. More realistically, a lot of the time we're going to be kind of ambivalentist towards technology. We're going to see some technologies as positive and some as bad, but when we're considering technology as a whole, it still seems fair to broadly put people in optimistic and pessimistic categories to one degree or another. My guess is that most of the people here on a day like today will be broadly optimistic, but I could be wrong about that. I should also mention that when we look at these categories here, obviously I'm trying to tease out the strong positions. Realistically, there is a continua, and there's a lot of positions to fill out on this matrix where you could sit. And so realistically, people are usually going to buy into a combination. So, these factors, your level of determinism, your level of inevitabilism, and your degree of optimism, give you a strategy for how you lever the future. And of course, these can be generalised for technology on a whole, or they can be particularised to individual issues. So just to give you a flavour on that general level of how these would work, and then we'll look at a couple of specific cases. If you're, and again here we're moving into that quadrant where we're moderate, so we want to look at that position where we have the maximum amount of leverage. We feel like technological development is not entirely inevitable, and where technology at least has some direct impact on well-being. But there's also the need to engage with social institutions, with political processes and so on and so forth. So the social levels, if we're primarily concerned with techno-determinism, are not really applicable, neither are, I should say, with optimistic techno-determinism, neither are they when we're pessimists, because on the whole we're interested in how we can actually impact the technology. But I think it's fair to say that optimistically, or optimists are often socially in their movements allied with rationalism, and pessimists tend to be allied with traditionalism. But there are certainly issues where that's not always necessarily the case. And maybe just check how I'm going for time. All right. So, socio-technological levers would include the kinds of things that we can do in a non-technical sense to broadly impact technological development. And if we want to work with technology, we might be looking at the promotion of technology through public education campaigns, tax breaks for technological upgrades, infrastructural improvements to our technology. The NBN could be a good example of that here in Australia, and the phasing out of old infrastructure. If we're pessimists about the long-term benefit of technology, we'll probably want to look at prohibitions and legal limitations against the use of technology. Politico-technological levers are the kinds of things that government could do directly. So this is about leveraging development rather than the actual impact of technology. And if we're working with technology to leverage its development, we're going to be looking at tax incentives for research, government direct research, investment in education, to directly lead to more technological development. Again, if we're pessimistic, we could be applying tax burdens for research, prohibitions against research, removal of government funding, and so on and so forth. And then we have, again, our direct technological levers. So these would be basic and applied research, and particularly research into areas that can further accelerate or catalyse other kinds of technologies. So we might look at forms of infrastructure, maybe seed artificial intelligence, linked data, gene sequencing, all these kinds of things which can impact a broad range of other areas. On the other hand, we could actually look at using technology to as a weapon against technology. So using one technology to mitigate, retard or destroy another. And perhaps the destruction of infrastructure and the abandonment of technology. So that's a general level. So now let's see how this plays out, that same matrix of possibilities plays out against some specific issues. I won't go into this too long. I want to wind up very soon. And the division between optimism and pessimism is kind of arbitrary in some of these cases, as I'll mention in a moment. But let's look at the case of strong artificial intelligence. If we're broadly optimistic about that, we may want to look at the social level, at how do we popularise friendly AI concepts, how do we debunk technological myths and prejudices. But if we're pessimistic, we may want to reinforce our prejudices against artificial intelligence and technology in general. Anti-technology political movements may be the way to go, and a general mood of cultural conservatism could be seen as appropriate. Socio-technologically, how do we lever the actual impact of the technology if it happens? Well, we might want positive laws that limit or shape the usage of artificial intelligence without blunting its positive impact. Or, pessimistically, we may look at laws that completely prohibit its usage. How do we actually leverage its development, optimistically? Well, we may want laws governing the design and function of AI systems. We may place restrictions on bodies allowed to engage in AI research to try and ensure that the ones that do it have a positive intention in mind. We may even invest heavily in research by potential benevolent first movers to try and ensure, as it is sometimes called, a positive singularity. And of course, the direct lever is actually to be one of those people that simply go out and do the research. But pessimistically, we may be one of those people that go out and actually try and destroy technology, or even perhaps build AI systems that are designed to destroy other systems. Perhaps we just want one AI that ensures that no other artificial intelligence is ever developed or does anything. And of course, we may look at laws preventing that kind of development. So that's artificial intelligence. Climate change. On the social level, optimistically, we have bright green environmentalism, as it's sometimes called. The deep ecology movement is often associated with a pessimism towards technology and its role in climate change, as is green anarchism. Socio-technologically, we could look at policies and programs designed to incentivise reduced resource consumption, but pessimistically, and again, if these divisions between optimism and pessimism aren't working quite for you, that's fine. We may look at policies designed to incentivise reduced economic participation in certain kinds of developmental rollback. We can look at investment and rollback again in terms of our political interventions. And there's a lot we can do with green tech. But again, if we're pessimistic about how we directly use technology, we might be starting to look at technological ways of deindustrialising. What processes can we create or invent to allow a more simplified existence, and maybe even survivalist techniques come into that. Okay, two more, and then we're done. Nuclear threat mitigation. I think nuclear weapons are really, really interesting in this debate, because I would, for what it's worth, broadly consider myself to be a fair old technophile, but I don't feel that great about nuclear weapons at all. So, we could be optimistic though, and want to disarm in a certain sense. I'm going to say that the pessimistic person here feels that nuclear weapons are inevitably bad, that there's no way to work ourselves through the minefield, so that if an armament movement may be the way that you want to go if you're this kind of pessimist, because you view nuclear war as simply inevitable, and we might as well work on being on the side that wins, if winning is a possibility at all. What can we do sort of socio-technologically? Well, we could have policies that encourage cosmopolitanism and internationalism and the development of international institutions. On the other hand, pessimistically, we may want to simply encourage population dispersal. In terms of politico-technological levers, there's a whole range, and they're already well and truly deployed. So we may see strategies like NAD as being the way to go, that we can work with the existence of nuclear weapons in a positive way to actually create peace. So, for example, having assured second strike capabilities through nuclear submarines is pretty much the way it's been done up until now. But nuclearisation and strategies for victorious nuclear war may be the way to go if you think that it can't possibly end well. And of course, there may be some actual technological development you can do to kind of actually improve the situation with nuclear weapons. Advanced nuclear reactors, like pebble bed reactors, are useful here in that they can be made to not produce weapons-grade material while we can still have nuclear power industry, for example. So there are things that we can do with technology to kind of aid the good side of what we know while hopefully mitigating some of the dangers of the negative side that we know. Okay, last one, poverty, mitigation, reduction and elimination. Effective altruism is something we hear a lot about at the moment. So there are a lot of social levers around attitudes towards this issue, human rights and sustainability. But of course, if we feel like poverty is not really a solvable problem, we may feel that appealing to religious frameworks, simply to prayer or to cultural relativism, even national isolationism may be the key here. That the real problem is that people have been wrenched from their traditional lifestyles and that they need to return to them. Those kinds of things are sometimes said. But optimistically, we can look at geopolitical interventions, and again, pessimistically, we may simply feel that we need to give way to armed resource conflicts, militarism, and to ensuring that we're on the right side. There's a lot we can do with technology in this area, but there's a lot we could do pessimistically with technology, and the way you want to go isn't necessarily clear depending on your stance. So again, we may feel that what really needs to be worked on here is better subsistence agriculture, better support of traditional lifestyles, maybe epidemiological quarantine through certain forms of social isolation. And in terms of leveraging the actual development, I think the optimistic categories are fairly obvious, and a lot of work is done there. But deindustrialisation, even depopulation policies could be our stance there. So that's all I want to say. I'm not going to try and offer you the magic solution, but my hope is that in giving you those frameworks, it kind of might bring some of these questions to mind when technology is being talked about in other contexts. So thank you.
Thank you.
Since the uptake of technology depends to some extent on the complicity of society, you might think that technology is actually only a part of the sociological framework. But on the other hand, where was I?
And that would certainly be sort of more techno and deterministic kind of position, at least to some extent, yes. That technology can't on its own create all the conditions required for human well-being. Okay. Certainly. Yeah.
Where do you find youth generated?
I think that moderate position is one that I would buy into on the whole. Certainly it's a debate where complexity plays and feedback plays a big role. So that makes it difficult. I don't think it makes it pointless to cash out where the parameters lie. I do have a certain sympathy for both determinism and inevitabilism, but on the other hand, and optimism too, but on the other hand, I don't think it's the whole story in every case.
It seems to me that you could tell, depending on your predisposition and what evidence you were looking at, compelling stories for really most of the positions that you've advocated. But from my perspective, I mean, this might sound sort of overly scientistic, but if we sort of want to figure out what's true or what the case actually is, then a good objective might be to try and define terms as clearly as we can and then go and, you know, try and test them. Do you know if there's like literature doing that, or people who try and actually do this, or is this just sort of
like looking at historical case studies to see what happened?
Or regressions, or like anything that tries to actually test the theories?
Yeah, well, I think my assumption, tell me if you disagree with this, is that history is going to be the only thing that's going to test any of these theories really well. And a lot of the debate is about history, you know. So that's the problem. It seems that there are strong ways that you can argue, and there's always a counter argument. So it's about balancing the considerations. I don't know if anyone has tried to sort of systematically go, well, here's as much data as we can get, and you know, here's a number that says that, you know, it's 0.7% or 70% determinism and 30% social determinism. So I think there's more work to be done. I think part of the problem here is that this field could be discussed more than it is. It's pretty obscure.
I guess it seems that you could easily sort of talk around in circles without sort of making progress unless you really try and define terms and look at the historical evidence carefully. Sort of what
and I don't think anyone's really done that level of depth of research except in particular contexts. So it's something waiting to be done.
Was that
We've
a
been
hand?
talking about determinism, which, I mean, it certainly carries with it the notion of prediction. And I guess I'm really trying to sort of work out my question here a bit, but we've got these suggestions that perhaps that technology is important, or that social cultural factors are important. But to what extent are we developing? I mean, is this just what you might call a post-dictive analysis, or are we actually generating a predictive theory?
Well, that's where the strategic parts came in, that I wanted to suggest that this is actually important, because depending on your position on these issues, the way in which you're going to approach your attitude to the world and to the future on any issue falls out. So if you can determine to what degree a particular area of human well-being is impacted by technology versus social factors, and whether you think that technology is good or bad, and whether you think that technology is sort of inevitably going to develop in a particular direction, can tell you something about how you should apply your energies depending on what you would like to see happen. Does that kind of answer the question? That it should be predicted?
I guess
Exactly.
I'm just trying to ask, are we able to, is the possibility here that we can actually, without being enthusiastic about technology or social change, is the possibility that we can actually predict what's going to happen? I mean, some people are enthusiastic about the singularity and some people aren't. But, I mean, yeah, I'm sorry.
It seems to me that part of what's interesting or important about this debate is that people implicitly have a position on it that informs what they do. Whether they're the kind of person who's in this room, whether they're someone who goes into science, whether they're someone who goes into politics, whether they're someone who's a bystander. But the point is that the implicit positions that people have are actually very divergent. So it's not clear that by entering into the debate we'll necessarily clarify things, but if we can clarify things, then maybe that will help us work out where we should direct our energies. Does that make sense?
I mean, look, suppose you went back prior to the Industrial Revolution, but in England, right, and looked at the social conditions and you know, scientific and technical developments. Do you think you could actually have predicted the Industrial Revolution? And I'm not just saying its existence, but its actual timing.
Well, my guess is that, and all I can offer you is a guess, my guess is that you could have predicted something of that form, but you certainly couldn't predict the details. That would be a guess. Yeah.
And I'm going to quote Jim Data, coming from a foresight perspective, that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And I think, has anyone here heard Hugo de Garis talk about Artilex? Because he's spoken at a few of the events that Adam's organised, and he has a very clear-cut scenario where the world goes to war about, you know, this AI intelligence and so forth. And I would look to that as an example of a dystopic scenario, you know. And what I really liked about your talk is the fact that you're looking at it like a possibility of futures, that it's not just a linear thing. And I guess coming to that, I was going to ask you what, because I mean, it's kind of like, it's a bit binary. It's like Unabomber or, you know, like Kurzweil, and it's like and everything in between. So I'm just kind of wondering if you have any dystopic or utopic scenarios or like preferred futures that you've touched on in your research.
Well, and again, I mean, I'd emphasise that this isn't really my area, but I guess my overall thing is that I'm generally optimistic, but I think Patrick's going to give a talk on existential risks. I think there are clear existential risks. So if those risks can be avoided or mitigated, my personality disposition is to feel like things could go in a really good direction, if that answers that question. But I'm not, you know, I think Kurzweil, for example, thinks that there's almost an inevitability about solving the risks as well. And maybe the Unabomber felt like there was an inevitability that it couldn't turn out well. I would tend to sort of think that there's a bit of path between those two.
Perhaps a war on inevitability then.
Maybe, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, just quickly, last question because we've got to move on to the next talk.
Just
Okay.
a quick question on this techno and social. Looking ourselves as a species, I mean, we've got the animal species. In the animal world, we've got intelligence and we've got animals that we've taught tools and high technologies, but they've never evolved using it. Could there be an argument because they don't have language and that hasn't helped the evolution of technology?
So there's a crucial factor which has prevented them from, and one of those factors in itself is kind of like technological, and that language is sort of has a technological aspect to it. So that then you need technology to develop technology, and it's not there, just social environment. Yeah, I guess you could kind of put that together. I never thought about it, but you know, I would be surprised if that's the whole story, of course. But yeah, maybe you could look at certain human groups that followed a pattern like that as well. But again, you know, if you're sort of a technological Darwinist, part of the problem is going to be that maybe there's not a lot of historical trace of who those societies were and what they were. But that's a whole other question, I guess. All right, thanks very much. Appreciate your attention.